the Hollywood Actor Podcast with Jennifer Marshall, Part 2.
Did you become part of the leadership within that organization, the Veterans for Film and Television?
I did. I had become a member in 2014, and then by 2015, I was the general manager of the organization. So I definitely dove in, and my first year in Hollywood, I guess Shonda Rhimes wrote a book later called A Year of Yes, but this was before this. I did A Year of Yes that was based off of a book of a woman who went on every date that she was asked on for a year. And it's a very funny book. And some of the men that she didn't necessarily want to date, she ended up really enjoying her time with them. So I said, I'm going to go on every audition. I'm going to submit for everything. I was still non-union. And I did that for a year. There was one audition I didn't go on because I thought it might be a snuff film or something. But for the most part, I went on everything, and I made so many contacts during that first year.
That's what I recommend for new actors that are in their market or coming to Hollywood, is they just have to expose themselves to the market in general, not just for the relationships that can develop out of that, but just to get an understanding of where you fit and who you are within everything.
Absolutely.
I mean, how else do you know who you are?
Yeah.
How else can you define yourself unless you put yourself within such a context?
Absolutely. And just even knowing the area, if you just say, well, I don't want to go on any auditions unless they're, top tier, which I understand. If you're SAG by the time you move here, you're kind of limited. But, I knew people that they didn't know where cast was. They didn't know where Hollywood Cast and Film, where Space Station was. And, cast is gone now, but they did a lot of indie types.
Oh, it is?
It is. It closed last year. Yeah. So, I remember just going to all these different places and really learning the lay of the land. And that's so important when you come to Los Angeles, because if you're trying to juggle auditions, as you know, if somebody's like, oh, you've got this one in Burbank and this one in Santa Monica, oof, good luck with that. That's an all day sort of thing, depending on the time.
Exactly. Yeah. You're going to burn a bridge there if you think you can make that audition and you just can't, even in an Uber.
Right.
So with that veterans organization, you said that came up a couple years into your experience, just saying yes to yourself in that year or multiple years starting out here in Hollywood?
It had come up. I had Googled when I first got here. There was nothing. And then a friend of a friend had messaged me and said, hey, you're a veteran, right? And I wasn't really getting that. People didn't really recognize me as that. So I said, what do you mean, like a veteran in the acting world or what? And they said, no, a military veteran. And I said, yes, of course. And they said, well, there's this organization that started up. And so I became a member then. And it's just been so useful. And some of my very good friends, are members. And the veteran community is amazing here. It's a very, very strong community that's very supportive.
Were you able to contribute to the organization just based on the commercials and industrials that you'd done in Virginia? Or were you finding that there were a lot of experienced actors that were within that organization that were helping to point other people in directions in terms of how do I package myself, being a veteran of the United States military? How do I point myself in the right, or, present myself in different ways? I guess, packaging myself in like a larger understanding of you being that veteran for the work that you're starting to
well, it was really great because by the time I became the general manager, I had already had my year of yes. I'd already been here about 2 years. So I knew people. I think I'd probably booked my first co-star by then. And there were some working actors in the group who had been here a long time who were doing very, very well. John Huertas, who was on Castle, and now he's on This Is Us. Tucker Smallwood from Contact and Star Trek. Mark Valley from Boston Legal. There were, Adam Driver now. Adam Driver was a Marine. So there were people here.
Exactly. Famously a veteran.
So there were people here who had kind of, paved the way. But it was difficult because that was my key into offices. And I would go into the office. They said, please submit veterans, real U.S. military veterans where applicable for veteran and military roles. And I would go in and I would hear consistently, you just don't look like a veteran or you don't fit what we're looking for. And I got so frustrated one day. I remember I was at Ocean Park and I walked back to my car and these hot tears are streaming down my face. And I called my husband and I was just tired of being told that, because what does a veteran look like? We're just a microcosm of society. So I called my husband and he said, this is the 5th time we've had this conversation. What are you going to do about it? Are you just going to complain or do something? And I said, no, you're right. I'm going to do something. So I went home and I set up a PSA PSA, and we did a public service announcement featuring female veterans and what a female veteran looks like. And after I set up to do one PSA and I ended up producing 15 of them. I never got that again. I never got the "you don't look like a veteran" again, because I think in certain people's minds, they have a very slim window of what they think a veteran is. And, it was difficult. And then when I put my reel together, I wasn't booking military things. And so I went and I filmed a scene and I put it on my reel. And right after that, I started booking military roles. I think sometimes you just have to put it out there. This is what I am. You can't assume that casting or producers or directors are going to see you as that. You have to give an example sometimes.
Mm-hmm. You're making it a little bit more explicit for them.
Oh, absolutely. And I get it. If you were to see me on the street, you wouldn't necessarily think that I'm a veteran, but I wanted people to just open up their minds a little bit and just consider me for that.
That's interesting, though, because you were dressed up to look like a military veteran in your headshots. You probably were dressed similarly when you walked into a casting office, but it took almost putting that into the action of the final form of video in terms of a PSA or short films or scenes that they literally had to look at, or putting that out into the world at large.
Oh, definitely. And there was one casting director, and I won't call him out, but he did, say to me, "You just, that was a good audition, but you just don't look like a vet." And I said, "I'm so sorry." I said, "What do you mean by that? Because I keep hearing that." And he said, "Well, more butch." So I appreciated his candor. And then that's, another thing that led me to do the scene for my reel so they could see me. But there is sort of this misconception, I think, with any sort of minority group that, oh, this is how, this should be. I have an African-American friend who's an actress, and she said she constantly gets asked to, be more street, be more urban. And she's like, "This is not who I am." This is not who I am. And you're trying to force me into this box. And I kind of felt the same way, that they were trying to force me out of the military box, because I can't be quote unquote more butch. You just are who you are.
Right. That's really interesting, though, how that's playing out in terms of these trends of all these, specifically Netflix shows, right? We're seeing these very unique voices of very unique people that are not necessarily portraying themselves as you would see them in a casting office. You're seeing them as they are on the street, or as they are in your home, at your school. And so the actual putting that, you're saying, we don't care if this is going to work or not. This is just a reality. Let's put this into the final product, as in a TV series or a Netflix film, and then we can start moving on from there. And we're seeing that. We're seeing TV series develop in terms of seasons and have offshoots, and that's changing the very fabric of casting.
Oh, absolutely.
decisions.
And, Orange is the New Black is a great example of, you have all these women who are impeccably glam when they're on the red carpet. But when they are, when in that show, there's very little makeup. There's, crazy hair. There's, teeth that aren't, fit for a Crest commercial. It's very much realism. And even in some of the scenes, the women, they're not size 0 women, and they're on the screen, in the locker room, in their bra, in their underwear. And I think that's why that particular show has been so successful, is because it's like, these are women's bodies. These are women, it's not about Botox and Spanx. This is just real life. And I really welcome that trend of people just kind of opening up their idea of what a woman is, or what a woman quote unquote should be.
Very much. And I wanted to backtrack and talk a little bit about that first co-star. What led you up to that? And can you talk a little bit around that project that you were working on?
My first co-star was on Colony, and Erica Silverman Bream was casting that when I went in. And she's wonderful. She, that first co-star, she said that she loved casting those because in that particular show, people's faces were covered. So when people's faces are covered, you kind of can gamble and give people their first co-star, or you can give somebody who maybe is a little more unusual looking, who wouldn't have as many opportunities for a co-star, because all you see are the person's eyes. So I went in and auditioned for that show, I think 4 times, and I ended up booking the show. And it was a small co-star. I was so grateful, because your first co-star and your first guest star are always really important, because it opens the door and it kind of gives other casting directors oh, okay, this person's worked on a set before. This person can be trusted. And she's a wonderful advocate for actors, and she's into education. And if you don't follow her on Twitter, please do so. So I was just so incredibly grateful for that. And I think, before that, I had booked a small role on General Hospital. And that was also important, because, when I went in to see Eric, I actually had something on my resume that was union. So I think the first big thing was the small role in General Hospital. And then my first co-star on Colony, those were 2 things that really kind of started the ball rolling here.
And you had to be union for the General Hospital. Did you get your SAG card through that project?
No, I'm trying to think what I got my SAG card from. It's been a few years. I did get so I became eligible because my friend had written a web series, and now he's a writer on my block on Netflix. And he had written a web series that was really, really great. And so I became eligible through that. And actually I got my SAG card from my first national commercial. It was a spec commercial, and I was non-union, and I had just done 1 line for a voiceover for it. And he ended up selling it. It was a Band-Aid commercial. He sold it. They picked it up. They flipped it SAG. And, that 1 line that took me 60 seconds, to do, ended up making me $3,000. And so that pretty much paid for me to get into SAG.
Yeah, it paid your initiation fee. Mm-hmm. That's great, though. I mean, that's the dream, is making the spec commercial, especially here in Hollywood. There's so many production companies that crank out spec commercials, trying to sell them, working with the young actors, or actors that are still trying to break in a little bit, because the production company can't afford to hire the largest crews. Mm-hmm. And so little bits and pieces cannot be as professional, but you're still, it's all kind of like an independent film. It's all about hope, trust, faith, and you just got to go in there with your eyes open and say, let's do this. Let's pray on this.
Right.
One.
And you can work on, 10 spec commercials or 10 indie films or 10 student films, and maybe one of them will make traction. So it's really just a numbers game.
You really never know.
You never know. Somebody had said, I just want to make a festival darling, and then my career will take off. And I said, well, how do you do that? Because if people knew how to do that, we would all be there. But
everybody would do that. Exactly.
And he said, I'm going to make something that goes to Sundance and it wins awards. And I said, well, to be fair, I think everybody wants to do that. The question is how? How do you know that it's going to be wildly popular?
Yeah. And it's getting harder and harder to do those types of things, because even though the technology is making it more accessible, there's more noise because everybody is making things like that.
Yes, absolutely.
And everybody's trying to follow the same sorts of formulas.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I don't really understand that idea as well, like putting one fact out into the universe, having the vision boards. I'm still not quite on board with a lot of that stuff, because it comes down to an equation. I don't think life works that way, and I sure as hell don't think the industry works that way. Otherwise, all the big studios would be making money hand over fist, and they lose lots of money all the time on big movies.
And they have
A-listers,
right? And they still lose money.
Yeah.
So
they still lose money because it's always a gamble, no matter the top of your game or you're just starting out. But I think the rule is that you just got to keep gambling.
Oh, absolutely.
And it looks like that you've been doing that your entire life.
Absolutely, I have. And I always tell people who want to get into the business, they think that it's linear. And, that just is hysterical. I told them hard work is important, but this is not a linear career where you do A, B, and C, and eventually you'll get to Z. That's not how it happens. It's just kind of whatever. Sometimes you can do one project. I heard of somebody who moved to LA. Her first audition was a series regular audition. She booked it. I mean, that's not the norm, but that's something that can happen. And then you have people who they'll book pilot after pilot after pilot. It never gets picked up. And then they decide to leave and, go be a soybean farmer somewhere. They get tired of it. So I always tell
Mm.
people, if you think that it's going to be linear and if you're going to be frustrated by it not being linear, this is not the business for you. Go be a lawyer, go be a doctor, go do something.
Yeah, you have to have you have to have that thing that's built up in you, that stubbornness, that thing that fights against the impossible, because it's like you're saying, it's not a logical thing. Just because you knock on a door doesn't mean it's going to open, but you just got to keep
Yep.
knocking, almost like a door-to-door salesman. Like you're saying, it's a numbers game. You just got to keep
Yep.
at it, and find your ways through it. Find the things that are still pulling you along. The original joy, or lust for competition, like you were saying. Trying to prove yourself on a certain path is that thing that's going to keep that fire within you, and not have you be reliant upon other people lighting fires.
Right. And I also feel like, as actors, we're here to create the art. And if you get into this sort of thing where you're doing, co-star after co-star after co-star, one day you're the cop and then you're the waiter, that's not really a creative journey so much. And I know some actors who say, I don't want to work on student films. I don't want to do that. And it just kind of baffles me, because you've got USC and UCLA, Columbia College, Chapman. You have all these amazing film programs, AFI. And the students that come out of these film programs, the Duffer Brothers from Stranger Things, they went to Chapman. You look at all these people who are creating projects now and are going to be writers, directors, and producers of tomorrow. So I always tell actors, if you're feeling stuck, maybe you should go audition for some of these student films. I'm working on a graduate level thesis film right now called The Gatekeeper, and it has been such an amazing experience, because I'm one of the leads in that film, and I can dig deep and get into a character and feel that grief and have that emotional journey. And when you're doing a lot of co-stars back to back to back, you're not getting that emotional journey and growing as an artist. You might be having fun, you might be on set professionally, it's great, but you're not really making art if you're a waiter, in a sitcom and you come up and ask them if they want more water. So I think that it's important to have that sort of mix if you're feeling stuck.
Yeah. And speaking of the career being nonlinear, I did notice that you had representatives all across the country. And that makes sense for you, formerly being based out of Virginia. But I noticed that you had a rep in Seattle, in Arizona. And do you send in tapes? Do you work all across the country? Do you bounce around depending on the opportunity?
I do. There are some markets where there's hardly any tapes. They're just, Pacific Northwest, for example. Grimm was up there, Portlandia. Nothing's really shooting up there besides local things. I don't want to shoot anything local. I don't want to go up there. But coming into the business over 30, I had to up my game and I had to up my hustle, and I can't just come to LA and kind of rest and, wonder what's going to happen. I had to hustle, and my husband used to work out of the country. So I had, a million frequent flyer miles or something crazy where I could do that. And, for me, it was about the hustle. And some people, they're not in a position to do it. They can't do it being military. I have friends that live everywhere. And I was going to take advantage of what I had, because the disadvantage was I was so much older coming in. I remember auditioning for a BET show, and the character was a veteran who was discharged dishonorably after 17 years, and she lost all of her benefits. And I thought, gosh, this is such a perfect role for me, and I can identify with this and the frustration and what she's feeling. And I went in and I was, going up against people who had recurring guest stars, and this was a co-star. So it's that sort of thing where I realized, if I'm going in for co-stars and you have people who are former recurring guest stars who are willing to do a co-star, I have to up my hustle, because I'm not going to get anywhere without it.
Yeah. How can I find my edge? How can I get my foothold? And trying to find those in the regions is very useful. I have a lot of friends, because my family now lives in Albuquerque, and New Mexico is just a hotbed for all of that. A lot of TV. Albuquerque Studios is now where Netflix's headquarters is located. So I keep bouncing between those places. I try to bounce around a little bit, but yeah, as much as I can afford in terms of money and time.
Right. And I will say this, if casting knows that you don't reside there, they're much less likely to even gamble on you. And I think that's fair because they want to give the actors there, an opportunity. And I understand that because when I was living in Virginia, they would consistently bring in LA actors and they wouldn't even allow us to audition for certain projects, which I found was very just discriminatory and not good practice.
Certain projects across the board?
Oh, yeah. There were certain projects, for the industrial, for the place that I worked that cast a lot of industrials. They said, well, for spokespeople, we're going to fly people in from LA. And I said, well, I would say audition the people you have here first because you might find a diamond in the rough, and they wouldn't even look at local people. So I totally understand when casting, they want to focus on the actors who are actually local. I understand that and I applaud that. But sometimes when you're looking for something very specific, I auditioned for a guest star through my Chicago agent. They were looking for a woman who was military who could possibly be a Navy SEAL. That is a very difficult sort of thing. Even for me, I'm not anywhere in the shape needed to be a Navy SEAL, but because of my service, that kind of gave me a leg up. But with such a specific call, sometimes they have to open it up, and I applaud that, and I'm there when they do so.
Yeah, I think you see that happening more and more, but it could always happen more. And some studios as well could open their doors a little bit more widely.
They could, and that's why I love self-tapes because, there's just so many more opportunities now. And I wish that, Atlanta does probably 90%, 85 to 90% self-tapes. But I still feel like LA, it's kind of pulling teeth with some offices. If you say, oh, I'm on set or I have a conflicting audition, can I do a self-tape? They're very hesitant to do it. And I understand that. But I, as an environmentalist, I'm always thinking, how much gas could we save if everything just moved to, to self-tapes and the congestion would be so much better. But I understand because in Atlanta, they were having the problem where people would get on set and sometimes they wouldn't be directable. And it's because in a self-tape, they were doing it 15 to 20 times before sending it in instead of just doing it, 2 to 3 times and picking your best take.
Yeah, they're trying to protect themselves. I'd also heard that in Georgia, they were having a bit of a problem getting people to set, once they'd book them or even for a callback, So they're trusting on the self-tape less and less. But, who knows? Who knows how that's going to go? It's the digital era. I think that's inevitable as traffic gets worse, as self-tapes look so much clearer. You can understand so much more information increasingly from them. So, and I want to double back a little bit. You were talking about that first co-star and then maybe a first guest star. And I noticed quite a few of really impressive credits on your resume. NCIS, Veep, Hawaii Five-0, for example. A lot of those were in the category of you being that military woman that you are. Did you feel like once you made that scene and then you started with that co-star on Colony that you were starting to really get that recognition within the industry?
I felt that they were more likely to recognize that I could play military or law enforcement. Hawaii Five-0, for example, my agent had told me about the breakdown and he said, you're perfect for this. I'm going to pitch you. And I don't believe I even got in for it on the first round. And then he had sent me the sides and he said, hey, I got you an audition for tomorrow. I got the sides at 9:30 at night because I was out with one of my friends who was in town that I hadn't seen for 5 years. So I got the sides at 9:30. My audition was at 9:30 a.m. And I knew once I got the sides, an actor is going to really struggle with this because it was a funeral scene. So she's doing a slow salute, but the script didn't say it was a slow salute. I just knew that it was. She's calling commands. She's speaking in, military jargon. I knew that a civilian would struggle and that I would not struggle. So I knew going in, I felt very, very confident about that audition. Jennifer Cooper's office is wonderful. I went in, I auditioned, I left, and then I believe I was pinned probably within 4 or 5 hours. So that sort of thing, it meant a lot to me because in this scene, I play a joint mortuary affairs officer who's overseeing the dignified transfer of an airman's body who was killed in Kabul. So to me, when I put on that uniform, that's not a costume. That is a uniform, it means something. I can look down at the ribbons. I understand what this means. I understand her journey. I understand what this means in the context of this airman's body is coming back and what that entails. So when I booked it, when I went on set, I was just so grateful that they saw that a veteran could bring something special to that particular role. And it resonated really well in the veteran community. That scene was tweeted and retweeted. And so many people were thankful
Really?
that they had cast a veteran who became an actor in that role, because I understood. And Jennifer in that scene would have been bawling because the subject matter is just so heavy. But Lieutenant Colonel Bailey, who I played, she does this on a daily basis. So she's very put together. She's very cognizant of this person's service and wanting to recognize it, but she can't show emotion in this.
And that's something that you not necessarily saw on a daily basis while you were in the military,
Oh,
but just
absolutely.
resonated
I
so
actually
deeply
have
with you.
lost more friends after coming home than I did in the military, to suicide, to post-traumatic stress, to substance abuse that culminated in very poor life decisions, drunk driving, things like that. So yes, I've lost friends, and that wasn't just a role for me. That was a life changer and one of the most important things I've ever done, probably.
I think as actors, we're trying to find those things that resonate most deeply with us. And, whether an audience, they identify certain gestures or not, they feel those vibrations through the screen. They see that this person is that person. They identify so strongly as that. There's such a confidence there, a richness in resonance that they're not.
Oh, absolutely.
They can't
And
help
for
but
for
be
that
moved.
particular episode, it brought home the sacrifice of the average, of a soldier, sailor, Marine, or airman who is killed abroad. Because in everyday society, we kind of think, oh, it's somebody else's war. But somebody else's war is claiming American, young men and women overseas. And it really brought home that sacrifice to the average viewer who probably doesn't think about our service members who are killed overseas. It brought it home for them and made it real. And that's why it was so important to me.
That's incredible that you get those opportunities to merge those lives that you've led. I'm so glad that you have that organization too, Veterans in Film and Television, that you can kind of reach out to and everybody can support and share amongst their own unique audiences. I've struggled with that myself, like trying to reach out to different types of organizations that overlap with myself, and how I identify and how I feel and and that impact that it's made on my like those people that share the experience that I have in my life and how I share in their experience. There's so much overlap between your personal and professional life that it's a very complicated discussion. It's a very complicated discussion to have, and I find that it's worthwhile to have that. There's no resulting answer to the lives that people have led, to the experiences that they've had, but to continue to have the conversation with those communities and with the larger world is something that is inherently human. I think that being performance artists, that we're in such a unique position that we, unlike your normal professional, we almost have a duty to continue to pursue those things that do overlap with our identities and other identities, to represent those in the world.
Absolutely.
With the veracity
and,
that
one
we
thing
have.
I'm very passionate about is, there's a show called Pose on FX, and they specifically went out of their way to include trans people in the writing process, the advising, the casting. And I feel like that's important because if you're going to tell someone's story, it can't be told by a bunch of, old white dudes in a writing room. It has to be told by people involved in that community. And one issue I always had with, I don't want to say the majority of Hollywood productions, but a good number of Hollywood productions is they want to tell the military story. They want to tell about post-traumatic stress. They want to tell about military sexual trauma, but they didn't want to invite veterans into the writing room. They didn't want to have veterans as technical advisors. They didn't want to have
Not even
veterans
as
on set.
advisors?
No,
Interesting.
there's a few there. there's been a few projects where we've reached out and said, hey, do you need an advisor? And it's like, no, we're good to go. And my issue is, if you're going to tell our story and profit off of our story, we just ask to be involved because we just want it to be told, correctly. And you would never have a show about the transgender community and not invite them to the table. So productions are getting better about it. They're seeing the importance of having advisors. They're seeing the importance of having people in the writing room, and they're seeing the importance of having actual military veterans audition for these roles. And it's not a guarantee. Sometimes a civilian actor gets it, and the best actor should get it at the end of the day. We don't ask to be cast. We just ask for the opportunity to audition. And I believe that's fair in those cases.
It's very fair. And I think it's more than... I think there's a fairness to having an advisor on a set as well, especially when you're telling stories that are of a very sensitive nature or a niche audience that general population doesn't necessarily have an acquaintance with or that has a limited understanding of, because then they are going to see those people on the silver screen or on their iPads. They're going to see those people and think that that's how those people act and interact.
Absolutely.
Generally. They're going to make those generic assumptions until they're told otherwise, because that's just how the human mind is wired. The first person we meet of a certain type of organization, tribe or whatever, we see that person, and that's how those people act and interact. And if we see that in a weak way, or we see that in any type of inaccurate way, it's just troubling.
Well, there's two shows that are doing it great. So Modern Family, Ed O'Neill, his character was in the Navy, and it doesn't really factor into the story, but it just shows he's a well-adjusted guy. He's got a family, but they do talk about his time in the Navy. That doesn't mean he has post-traumatic stress. That doesn't mean that he's, about to fly off the handle. It's just part of who he is. So I love that. And I also love the storyline on This Is Us. They brought in a journalist named James Laporta, who's a former Marine, and he is, was in the writing room, and he was advising for it. And the storyline on This Is Us, the military storyline, is so accurate. It's so heartfelt. It's so wonderful, and it just makes it that much better having that input.
Have you done any advising?
I have. So my credit from Veep is for technical advising. We did the funeral scene in the end. Spoiler alert, but if you haven't watched it by now, you're not really a fan. So we did the funeral scene in the end, and that was very specific. You need military veterans who are in height, weight standards to be able to wear that uniform, and you need people who have worked funeral detail before. So they were talking about maybe bringing in some background people. You cannot have background on that. It has to be highly trained people with experience in that area. And we did 2 takes, and then we were done because everybody was very squared away. So I also do technical advising for the Department of Veterans Affairs PSAs, and I'm executive producing the next PSA, which should be, we are going to shoot that in December. And that's really important because that airs on television, and veterans all over the country see it, and you want it to really be accurate and to speak to those veterans so that they do call and get help if they need it.
Wow. It sounds like you're doing great work communicating your veteran experience with the Hollywood film and television industry. You're doing as much as you can to plug in here.
It's a delicate balance.
More than your fair share.
It's a delicate balance. You don't want to be too pushy, but you do want productions to see the importance of bringing in veterans and making us a solution to the problem they have. We don't really know how to shoot this. We don't really know what's going on. And then, sometimes you're on set and you have to know when you're hired to be an actor and not really say, well, these uniforms are wrong. This is wrong. That's wrong. I always just say, I'm here if you want any information. But I know my place on set. With Hawaii Five-0, I was very lucky. I went on set. The director had said to me, you're the subject matter expert. You let us know if there's anything, that should be changed, that's not accurate. I mean, he was wonderful. And then I've been on other sets where, things have been kind of crazy. And, I've been told by wardrobe, this is our creative license and this is how we want to put this uniform together. And, it's kind of a hard pill to swallow, but I'm not there to be an advisor. I'm there to be an actor in that particular circumstance. So it's a fine line that I straddle often.
Yeah. But like you said, you're there if they're willing
absolutely.
to meet you.
I always just say I'm here to be a source of information if you need it. And if you choose not to, that's certainly on you too. And I think it helps, so many vets say, I want to be an advisor. And I'm like, no, to be an advisor, you have to understand REEL and REAL, and you have to meet them in the middle. And if you don't have a film background, it's very difficult because you come in and say, well, it should be A, B, and C. But aesthetically, you really don't want, aesthetically, it really should just be maybe A and maybe B. Not everything can be 100% accurate all the time.
Thanks for listening to the Hollywood Actor Podcast. If you enjoy this content, don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, and share.